The morning sun filtered gently through the window, casting a warm, golden light across the inn. Outside, the world seemed quiet, almost holding its breath, as if waiting for a choice to be made. She stood by the small wooden table, staring at her reflection in the polished surface, feeling the weight of the decision she now faced pressing down on her chest. The town she had fled, with its judgments and unrelenting expectations, tugged at the edges of her thoughts. It represented familiarity, however bitter a life she had known, with all its limitations and cruelties, and then there was him. The Apache who had not only saved her life but had shown her trust, compassion, and a steadiness she had never experienced before. The man whose presence had quietly, persistently altered the trajectory of her existence. His eyes had always held a balance of strength and understanding, but now they seemed to silently ask her to make a choice, one that could not be. Undone, her fingers brushed the edge of the chair, grounding herself. She had spent weeks in this sanctuary, feeling fear melt into trust, and trust bloom into something far more profound. Her heart had begun to recognize that love was possible here in the quiet rhythm of shared chores, late-night conversations, and moments of unspoken intimacy. Yet the pull of her past life, the life she had fled with only desperation as her guide, remained a tangible force, reminding her of obligations, unfinished business, and old fears. He approached quietly, as he always did, observing her without judgment. There was no pressure in his step, no demand in his voice. "Have you decided?" he asked gently, the faintest tilt of his head betraying a hope he did not dare to voice aloud. She met his gaze, feeling the steady warmth in his eyes, the safety that had become her anchor. I've thought about it every night," she admitted. "I've imagined going back, returning to the life I knew, but I can't. I can't face that world again, not alone. Not without hope that things could be different." He nodded, silently acknowledging her struggle without pressing further. His patience had always been a quiet lesson in trust, letting her make her own decisions, guiding without controlling, protecting without smothering. She realized now that this was the man she wanted in her life, not because he had saved her from danger, but because he had awakened courage, trust, and love in her heart. "I choose to stay," she said finally, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly with the weight of the moment. "Not because I'm afraid of the world, but because I believe in what we can build here together." A small, almost imperceptible smile curved his lips. He stepped closer, closing the distance, and extended a hand, not commanding, but offering partnership. She took it, feeling the warmth and strength in his grip, the silent promise that they would face whatever came next side by side. The air seemed lighter, the inn itself almost exhaling in relief. Outside, the sun climbed higher, illuminating the path forward. She realized that the choice was not simply about leaving or staying. It was about embracing a future defined by trust, companionship, and the possibility of love. The Apache had not just offered her protection, he had given her agency, the courage to choose her own fate. As they walked together outside, hands brushing, heart steady with unspoken understanding, she knew that her life had changed irrevocably. The fear that had once dictated her every step had been replaced by hope, and the lonely road she had traveled for so long was finally shared. Together, they would face the world not as protector and protected, but as partners, equals, and perhaps something far deeper than either had dared to imagine. In that choice, in that shared resolve, her fate was no longer uncertain. It was theirs to shape, side by side, with trust, courage, and love as their guide. The sun rose slowly over the mesas, bathing the inn in a soft golden light that seemed to promise a new beginning. Inside, the quiet rhythm of the morning was filled with familiar sounds, the gentle crackle of the hearth, the soft clink of cups, and the measured steps of two people moving in harmony. The woman, no longer a stranger in this place, moved through the small space with ease, her heart light and steady. She had made her choice, and each passing day confirmed that staying was more than just a decision. It was a commitment to trust, love, and shared life. The Apache watched her from across the room, his dark eyes reflecting warmth and quiet pride. The bond between them had grown from something fragile and tentative into a foundation strong enough to weather both the small, everyday challenges and the extraordinary dangers they had faced. He moved deliberately, placing a fresh loaf of bread on the table, glancing at her with a small nod that said everything words could not. She approached him, carrying a cup of tea, and handed it over with a shy, yet genuine smile. "Good morning," she said, the words carrying the ease of familiarity, the comfort of trust. "Good morning," he replied, his voice steady, calm, yet tinged with something softer approval, perhaps even affection. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures. The depth of their connection was communicated through these small, shared moments, quiet acts of attention, and mutual care. Later, as the morning light filled the single bedroom, she made the bed with a sense of contentment. The one bed that had once seemed like a limitation now symbolized everything they had built together. It was no longer a mere piece of furniture. It was a testament to trust, intimacy, and shared life. Each wrinkle in the sheet, each carefully folded blanket spoke of their cooperation and growing closeness. She ran her hand over the smooth linen and felt a smile tug at her lips. For the first time, she truly felt at home. He entered quietly, pausing at the doorway, and she looked up, meeting his gaze. There was a soft understanding in his eyes, a reflection of her own feelings. Without words, he approached and rested a hand gently on hers, a silent acknowledgment that their lives were now intertwined. She felt the steady warmth of his touch, the strength and reassurance that had always been his presence, and a deep sense of peace settled over her. Their days were no longer measured by fear or uncertainty. Each morning brought new tasks around the inn, tending to the garden, repairing fences, and preparing meals, mundane duties made meaningful by the partnership and trust they shared. The afternoons were often spent walking the surrounding trails, learning from one another, laughing quietly at small jokes, or simply sitting together in companionable silence, letting the natural world around them provide solace and inspiration. Evenings were the most precious. They would sit near the fire, sharing stories, dreams, and occasionally lingering touches that spoke louder than words. The single bed, once a source of nervousness, had become a place where they rested side by side, where vulnerability was met with trust and warmth was shared freely. It was a symbol of the life they had chosen, a life of partnership, respect, and love. In this small, remote inn, they had created a world of their own making. The dangers of the past no longer dictated their lives. The future, once uncertain, was now a landscape of possibility. They had chosen each other, and in doing so, they had rewritten their fates. As the fire crackled softly and the sun dipped behind the mesas once more, she leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her hand. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine a future filled with hope, trust, and love. The Apache who had changed her fate now walked beside her, not as a protector alone, but as a partner, a companion, and the keeper of her heart. Together they faced the world, not just surviving it, but embracing it. And in that shared life, the one bed became a symbol of everything they had built: unity, resilience, and a love that would endure beyond fear, beyond danger, beyond the past. The quiet rhythm of their days was shattered one late afternoon by the distant sound of hoofbeats echoing through the valley. At first she froze, every nerve screaming that danger had returned. The men from the town, the ones she had escaped, were coming back, more determined than before. Her heart raced, memories of past fear flooding in. But the Apache, calm and alert, immediately sprang into action. He moved with a precision born of experience, surveying the landscape, noting escape routes and vantage points, silently instructing her without words. She followed, her fear tempered by the trust that had grown over weeks. This was the moment she had been preparing for unknowingly, the first true test of everything they had built together, their connection, their reliance, and their courage. The Apache directed her to a hidden area near the back of the inn, a space where she could remain unseen but ready. His movements were fluid, almost invisible, as he positioned himself between her and the approaching threat. Watching him, she felt a mixture of awe and relief. He was fearless, not reckless, and every decision he made reflected a deep understanding of both the terrain and the men they faced. As the first figures appeared over the ridge, shouting and brandishing weapons, she realized that her own heartbeat had steadied. She was no longer the trembling woman who had first arrived at the inn. She could trust him, and more importantly, she had begun to trust herself to stay calm, to act when needed. The confrontation was swift. The men attempted to charge, underestimating the Apache's skill and the natural advantages of the terrain. He moved like a shadow, striking only when necessary, disarming and disabling rather than seeking harm. She watched, breath caught in her throat, as he protected both her and the inn with a skill and courage that seemed almost otherworldly. At one point, one of the men broke through their initial defense, coming too close for comfort. Without hesitation, he stepped in front of her, positioning himself between her and the danger. For a brief, suspended moment, their eyes met. There was no need for words, his gaze said it all. "I've got you. Trust me." And in that moment, she did. Her trust was rewarded. With calculated movements, the Apache neutralized the threat, forcing the intruders to retreat. The sound of hoofbeats faded, replaced once again by the soft rustle of wind through the trees and the quiet settling of the inn. She sank to the ground, her knees trembling, but this time from relief rather than fear. He came to her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "You were brave," he said quietly, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You stayed calm when it mattered." She shook her head, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "No, you were brave. You saved me." He gave a faint nod, a shadow of a smile touching his lips. "We saved each other," he corrected softly, and she realized he was right. Their bond, tested by danger, had proven stronger than either had expected. It was not just protection or reliance, it was partnership, trust built in the crucible of fear and survival. That night, as they tended to minor injuries and repaired the damages to the inn, she felt the depth of their connection more keenly than ever. They had faced real danger together, and each had witnessed the other's courage, resilience, and skill. The experience left them both changed, bound not only by survival, but by the unspoken understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together. In the flickering light of the fire, she realized that fear no longer defined her. She had found a protector, a companion, and perhaps something more in the Apache who had stepped into her life and changed its course. The first test was over, but its consequences, the strengthening of trust and the deepening of their bond, would echo long into the days to come. The inn was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that felt almost sacred after days filled with tension, danger, and the steady rhythm of survival. The fire in the hearth cast long, dancing shadows across the wooden walls, creating a warm glow that softened the edges of the room. She sat near the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, staring out at the darkened valley and the glimmering stars above. He was nearby, tending to the small tasks that never seemed to end in the inn, but his movements were slower, almost deliberate, as if he too felt the weight of the night stillness. There had been a subtle change between them since the confrontation with the men from the town. Something unspoken had shifted, a tension that was no longer fear, but something far more complex, something she was only beginning to recognize as desire. Admiration and trust intertwined. Her gaze drifted toward him, noticing the way the firelight caught the angles of his face, highlighting the steady calm in his eyes. For a long moment, she simply watched, absorbing the quiet intensity he carried. She felt her heart stir in ways she had not allowed herself for years, a fluttering that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to explain this, but I feel safe with you. More than I ever have before. He paused, looking at her with a measured calm. It is not just safety, he said quietly. It is trust. And trust is earned, not given lightly. Her breath caught. He was right, and in that truth lay the foundation of what she felt. Over the weeks, through shared meals, quiet conversations, and the danger they had faced together, she had come to rely on him, not just for protection, but for the strength he inspired in her. Yet now, the feeling extended beyond reliance. It was deeper, personal, and undeniably intimate. The room seemed to shrink, the space between them charged with unspoken words. She shifted slightly, the chair creaking, and found herself speaking again. I've never felt like this before. Not safe, not seen. Not like someone cares for me just because I exist. He moved closer, a deliberate, careful motion, closing the gap just enough to bridge their connection without overstepping boundaries. She could feel the warmth of his presence, the strength that had been her shield in the confrontation with the men, radiating in a quiet, comforting way. You are not alone, he said softly, and you are never as alone as you believe. You have strength. You have courage, and you have me. Her pulse quickened at his words, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the truth of it, that she wanted to be near him, to share not just this room, but her life, her fears, and perhaps her heart. She glanced at the bed, small and unassuming, and realized the intimacy it symbolized. Not just a place to rest, but a space to share trust and closeness, to surrender vulnerability to someone who had already proven worthy of it. For a long while, neither spoke. They simply existed in the same space, the firelight flickering around them, their breath slowly sinking with the quiet rhythm of the room. The moment was fragile, delicate, yet charged with an intensity that neither could ignore. In that silence, she understood something profound, that her life had been irrevocably altered. The Apache had not only saved her from danger, but he had awakened feelings she had long buried: hope, trust, and the possibility of love. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a daring kind of courage, the courage to allow herself to feel, to trust, and to embrace the uncertainty of what could come next. The moment hung in the air like a suspended heartbeat, and she knew, without doubt, that whatever path lay ahead, it would be walked together. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the small room. Outside, the night had settled in completely, a velvet darkness punctuated only by the faint glimmer of stars above the mesas. She sat on the edge of the bed, knees drawn up slightly, staring into the flames. The events of the day replayed relentlessly in her mind, the men who had come for her, the fear that had threatened to consume her, and the quiet, unwavering strength of the Apache who had stood between her and danger. He sat across from her, leaning against the wall, the light illuminating just enough of his face to reveal the calm determination in his eyes. They had spoken little since the attack, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding, a space where words were unnecessary yet trust was palpable. Finally, unable to bear the weight of her thoughts any longer, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried the urgency of months of suppressed emotion. I don't know how I survived, she admitted, her gaze dropping to her hands. I don't know how I managed to keep running, to keep hiding, when every day felt like it was trying to crush me. He didn't respond immediately. He simply watched, patient, allowing her to unburden herself without interruption. That alone was a comfort, no judgment, no unsolicited advice, just presence. "I've spent so long thinking I was alone," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "that no one could ever care, that if I let my guard down for even a moment, I would be gone. And yet—" Her words faltered as she looked up at him, meeting his unwavering gaze. "And yet, here you are. You came for me, protected me, and didn't ask for anything in return. Why?" The Apache's expression softened, though he remained composed. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "Because some things are bigger than fear. Some things are about trust and about seeing someone for who they truly are." She swallowed hard, the words resonating in her chest. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt seen, not as a victim, not as someone to pity, but as a person worthy of protection, worthy of respect. Her heart, long shuttered against the world, felt the faintest flutter of hope. I've never had anyone like you," she confessed, her voice breaking slightly. "Someone who doesn't expect me to be brave, who just lets me be. Who doesn't judge, who doesn't push, but somehow makes me feel stronger just by being near." He gave a faint nod, acknowledging her words without making her feel exposed or vulnerable. "Strength isn't always about fighting," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's about letting someone help you. Sometimes it's about trust." She let the silence settle, letting his words sink in. For the first time, she allowed herself to relax fully, to feel the warmth of the fire, the safety of the room, and the presence of someone who had proven that she could rely on him. Her fear didn't vanish, but it was tempered by trust, by connection, by the knowledge that she was no longer entirely alone in the world. As the night deepened, they remained there, close in proximity but not intrusive. She felt the fragile threads of something more beginning to form, something that went beyond gratitude, beyond mere reliance. Something that promised comfort, understanding, and perhaps even love, if she was brave enough to allow it. In the quiet intimacy of that night, with only the fire and the shadows as witnesses, she realized that her life and her heart had shifted in ways she could never have anticipated. And for the first time, she felt that perhaps she didn't have to face the world alone anymore. The days that followed carried a rhythm all their own, each one layering upon the last to build a quiet, unspoken bond between them. The inn, once just a refuge from the dangers of the outside world, had become a place of shared effort and companionship. She found herself waking earlier than usual, not out of fear, but to help with chores, sweeping the floors, carrying water from the well, tending to the small garden outside. The Apache observed her work silently, occasionally offering guidance, but never commanding or criticizing. It was in this subtle interaction, this quiet respect, that trust began to deepen. He, in turn, allowed her to glimpse more of his life, sharing stories in fragments, small pieces that revealed the man behind the stoic exterior. He spoke of the harsh winters he had endured alone, the loss of family he never truly recovered from, and the lessons the land had taught him, lessons of patience, resilience, and survival. There was no self-pity in his words, only honesty. She listened, often in silence, but each story planted a seed of understanding, a recognition that the man before her was shaped by experiences as harsh as her own. Though different in nature, their bond grew not through grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but through shared moments, simple, everyday acts that became intimate in their constancy. She learned to prepare meals the way he liked them, noticing the smallest details, like the way he preferred his coffee strong and bitter, or how he arranged herbs in neat rows on the counter. He, in turn, began to trust her judgment, allowing her to make decisions for the inn, showing quiet approval with a nod or a subtle smile. There were times of laughter as well, rare, fleeting, and precious, but they existed. Once, she had tried to teach him a small, clumsy song from her childhood, and he had hummed along, not perfectly, but with a willingness that had made her laugh until tears came to her eyes. He laughed too softly, deeply, a sound that carried warmth rather than mockery. In those moments, the walls around their hearts seemed just a little thinner, and yet the bond was not without tension. Their closeness brought with it the possibility of vulnerability, a concept both had long avoided. She found herself caught between fear and longing, unsure of how much to reveal or how much to allow herself to feel. He, too, seemed to navigate this new closeness cautiously, never overstepping, yet showing through subtle gestures, offering a blanket, lending a steadying hand when she lost her balance, sharing a quiet smile that he cared more deeply than he admitted. One afternoon, as they worked side by side repairing a broken fence on the property, she glanced at him and noticed the ease with which he moved, the confidence in his actions, and the quiet strength that seemed to emanate from him effortlessly. She realized, almost with surprise, that she admired him not just for his skill or courage, but for the integrity he carried in every action, for the way he faced the world with a steady heart, even when it had been unkind to him. He, in turn, watched her with a mixture of amusement and respect, noticing the resilience that shone through even in her smallest actions. He saw how she faced challenges with determination, how she laughed even when situations were difficult, and how she approached life with a cautious hope he had almost forgotten existed. By the time the sun dipped behind the mesas, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the bond between them had become undeniable. It was a connection forged not only through shared survival, but through understanding, respect, and quiet admiration. Though neither spoke the words aloud, both knew that this unlikely companionship was transforming into something far deeper, a foundation for trust, loyalty, and perhaps a love neither had dared to name. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the small window, casting warm patterns across the wooden floor. She woke slowly, feeling the comfort of the single bed beneath her, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel an immediate rush of fear. The inn was quiet, save for the faint sound of the Apache moving about downstairs. There was a rhythm to his movements, a careful, practiced efficiency that suggested years of living in harmony with both the land and the demands of survival. She dressed quickly, wanting to put some distance between herself and the lingering shadows of her past, and made her way downstairs. The smell of fresh bread and coffee greeted her, and she found him arranging a small breakfast on the wooden table. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative, and though he spoke little, each gesture carried purpose. "Morning," she said cautiously, testing the waters of conversation. He looked up, offering a small nod, and replied, "Morning." His voice was steady, neutral, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity in the way his eyes lingered on her. It wasn't intrusive. It was simply observant, noting the lines of fatigue around her eyes, the careful way she carried herself. Over the next few days, they fell into a quiet routine. She helped with simple tasks, sweeping the floor, chopping firewood, arranging supplies, and in turn, he shared small stories about life in the region. At first, it was factual, almost mundane, how the river ran low during summer, which herbs were best for healing wounds, which trails were safest to travel. But gradually, fragments of his past began to emerge, like carefully placed stones forming a path. He spoke of a family he had lost, of winters that were harsher than any human should endure, and of times when trust had been betrayed so completely that he had learned to rely only on himself. She listened intently, never prying, yet absorbing every detail. In response, he shared fragments of her own story, carefully chosen truths about a town that had turned against her, about people she had hoped would care but didn't. Their conversations were never long, but in them, trust began to build, silently, like roots burrowing into soil. There was laughter too, rare and cautious, when he pointed out the absurdity of her fear of rats, or when she teased him about his strict routine. These small moments of levity became a bridge between them, a way to connect without words fully defining their bond. One afternoon, she noticed him watching her as she repaired a broken chair, his expression thoughtful. "You're patient," he said quietly, almost as if speaking the observation aloud made it more real. She smiled, a faint, tired curve of her lips. "I've had practice," she replied. It was in these quiet exchanges that she began to see the man not just as a protector or a mystery, but as someone whose presence felt steady, grounding. She realized she was beginning to rely on him, not in the way one depends on a lifeline in a crisis, but in a subtler, more profound way, her heart starting to acknowledge that trust was possible again. Even as her guard remained partially up, she felt a warmth she hadn't felt in months. The inn, once just a temporary refuge, was beginning to feel like a home, and the man who ran it was no longer a stranger but a companion, albeit one wrapped in layers of secrecy and solitude. By the end of the week, a subtle shift had occurred. They no longer exchanged just formalities or careful observation. Instead, their interactions carried a rhythm of familiarity. She felt comfortable enough to linger in conversation, and he, in turn, seemed willing to reveal more of himself. In this quiet companionship, a fragile bond had been forged, one that neither of them could yet name, but both felt growing stronger with every shared moment. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and pine from the surrounding hills. She had just stepped outside to fetch water from the small well behind the inn when the first unease crept into her chest. The wind, usually playful and soothing, felt heavier today, carrying distant, indistinct sounds that set her nerves on edge. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination, but instinct, honed by months of running and hiding, told her otherwise. When she returned to the inn, she found him standing near the door, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the horizon. The calm, deliberate man she had come to trust seemed suddenly charged with tension. He noticed her hesitation and said nothing at first, letting her read the subtle signals: tightened jaw, a hand resting lightly on the hilt of a knife she hadn't noticed before. "They're coming," he said quietly. The words were simple, almost understated, yet they carried the weight of certainty. She froze, her heart racing. For a moment, the quiet, protective safety she had begun to feel seemed fragile, as if it could shatter with the slightest misstep. "They? Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Men from the town," he replied, his gaze sharp and unflinching. "The ones you left behind. They won't stop until they find you." Panic surged through her, but he didn't falter. Instead, he guided her inside, moving with a fluid efficiency that suggested he had prepared for moments like this many times before. He barricaded the doors and windows with quick, precise motions, teaching her silently how to reinforce the weak points without causing alarm. Each instruction, though simple, carried authority, and she followed without question, realizing that survival now depended not only on her own skills but on his guidance. As the hours passed, the distant sounds of hoofbeats and shouting began to grow louder. The men were getting closer, their intentions clear. She felt fear like a physical weight pressing against her chest, but the Apache remained calm, his presence a stabilizing force amid the chaos. He moved with precision, anticipating their moves, checking the perimeter, and preparing for confrontation. During a brief pause, he finally spoke. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low but firm. "No matter what happens, trust me." She nodded, the words simple but grounding. She had never met anyone like him, someone who could radiate both strength and trust simultaneously. It was disorienting, yet comforting. For the first time since fleeing, she felt a sense of possibility, that she might not have to face danger alone, that someone could stand beside her and shield her from the world's cruelty. The attack, when it came, was sudden. The men stormed toward the inn, shouting and brandishing weapons. The Apache met them with calm, precise action, moving like a shadow through the chaos. His knowledge of the terrain and his own skills turned what could have been a disaster into a tense, controlled confrontation. She watched in awe and fear as he outmaneuvered them, his every decision deliberate, his focus unwavering. By the time the men were forced to retreat, silence fell over the inn once more. The air was thick with a lingering scent of dust and sweat, her heart still pounding from adrenaline. She realized with a mixture of relief and awe that her fate had changed yet again. The man who had offered her a simple room and respected her boundaries had now shown her that he could protect her when the world became dangerous. For the first time, she felt the weight of gratitude and something deeper, an unspoken acknowledgement that she was no longer entirely alone. The trust she had begun to feel in their growing friendship had been tested in the most intense way possible, and it had endured. As night fell, they sat together in the quiet of the inn, neither needing to speak. The danger had passed, at least for now, but the bond forged in shared fear and reliance had become undeniable. She realized that her life was no longer entirely her own to navigate. She had someone by her side who would change the course of her fate forever. The sun was sinking low behind the distant mesas, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson when she finally spotted the inn. It was small, unassuming, almost hidden among the rocky terrain, its wooden walls weathered by years of harsh winds and relentless sun. Every step she took toward it felt like walking through a storm of memories she didn't want to confront. The town she had left behind had been unforgiving, suffocating, full of people whose eyes carried judgment rather than compassion. Now this inn seemed like a sanctuary, a fragile promise of safety. She paused at the entrance, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face and adjusting the worn cloak around her shoulders. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound echoing softly in the quiet of the empty common room. The air smelled faintly of pine smoke and dust, a comfort in its simplicity. Behind the counter, a figure moved with calm, deliberate precision. He was tall and solidly built, with the quiet authority of someone who had survived the unforgiving world outside these walls. His hair was long, dark, and tied back neatly, and his eyes, dark, piercing, yet not unkind, watched her closely. "Welcome," he said, his voice low and steady. There was no trace of unnecessary politeness, but neither was there judgment. It was as if he had already measured her, understood her weariness, and simply acknowledged her presence. I need a room," she said, her voice slightly trembling despite her best effort at composure. He nodded without question, motioning for her to follow. The inn smelled faintly of dried herbs and pine, a soothing combination that made her tense shoulders relax slightly. As they climbed the narrow staircase, her heart pounded not from exertion, but from the strange mix of fear and anticipation that always came when entering a new place where no one knew. When they reached the room, he opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Her eyes quickly scanned the space, modest yet clean. A single window allowed the last rays of sunlight to filter in, illuminating the simple furnishings, a table, a chair, and a bed neatly made with crisp linens. She hesitated, her cheeks warming because there was only one bed. "My room." "It only has one bed," she whispered, almost as if saying it aloud could change the fact. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery or disapproval, but found none. Instead, there was a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement without intrusion. He simply nodded and turned to leave, closing the door gently behind him, giving her space and dignity. Alone, she let out a shaky breath, realizing that for the first time in weeks, perhaps months, she felt a flicker of safety. She sat on the edge of the bed, letting her hands rest in her lap, her mind trying to slow the rapid beat of her heart. Who was this man who ran such a simple place yet seemed capable of protecting her? Why did his presence, so quiet and unassuming, make her feel simultaneously wary and oddly comforted? Outside, the wind whispered through the surrounding canyons, carrying the scent of sage and earth. Inside, she felt the walls close around her in a way that didn't feel suffocating but protective, as though the room itself had been prepared for someone like her, someone who had nowhere else to go and little courage left to face the world. And though she had yet to speak more than a few words with the innkeeper, the first, fragile threads of trust had begun to form, delicate as spider silk yet strong enough to promise that maybe this small inn could be the place where her fate would start to change. The moment she stepped fully into the room, her chest tightened. It was smaller than she had imagined, cozy, almost intimate, but the sight of the neatly made bed immediately drew her attention. Her mind raced. A single bed, just enough for one person. She swallowed, feeling the heat rise to her cheeks, and whispered, almost to herself, "My room only has one bed." She hadn't intended it as a confession, yet the words carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. In her previous life, safety had always been a luxury, and now, alone in this unfamiliar place, the smallest details seemed magnified. Her gaze flicked to the bed again, then to the Apache innkeeper who had paused at the door. She expected judgment, amusement, or even intrusion. She was ready to explain, to defend herself if necessary, but instead, he simply nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement, respectful and unassuming. There was no laughter. No unnecessary words. Just a quiet presence that somehow made the room feel less confining, less threatening. She could sense the steadiness in his posture, the calm assurance that this space, for all its simplicity, was a sanctuary. Her instincts, honed by months of evasion and mistrust, told her that this man would not exploit her vulnerability. And yet, the tension in her chest refused to fully dissipate. She moved toward the bed, brushing the smooth linens with the back of her hand, feeling the crispness of the sheets under her fingers. Every nerve in her body seemed alert to the silence, alert to the shadows cast by the fading sunlight through the window, alert to the presence of the man outside the door. Her thoughts spun in a chaotic mix of relief and fear. Relief that she had found a place to rest, fear that this safety might be fragile, temporary. The innkeeper lingered for a moment, then spoke softly. "I'll give you privacy." His words were simple, but they carried a weight she hadn't expected. In them, she heard respect and patience. She realized then that trust was being offered, not demanded. She nodded briefly, not trusting her voice yet, and allowed herself to sink onto the edge of the bed. Her mind wandered back to the journey that had brought her here. The danger she had escaped, the man who had pursued her, the accusations, the endless judgment of a town unwilling to understand felt like distant shadows now. Yet, she couldn't completely shake the fear. She kept her belongings close, her hand brushing the edge of her bag as if it could serve as a shield. Even in a room so small, her survival instincts were alive. Vigilant hours seemed to stretch in that quiet, unassuming room. She explored the space methodically, opening drawers, inspecting the window latch, testing the door, small rituals that gave her a sense of control in a world that had repeatedly denied it. And throughout it all, the presence of the man outside, calm and unobtrusive, was both reassuring and unnerving. By the time twilight turned to night, she had begun to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: safety. Not complete safety. She knew that danger was never far, but a fragile, tentative promise that for tonight, at least, she could rest without fear. The single bed no longer felt like a limitation but a symbol of her current solitude, a space where she could begin to reclaim herself, and somewhere in the quiet understanding between them, unspoken but palpable, the first seeds of connection had been sown. He respected her boundaries, yet his very presence suggested protection. She realized that her fate might be changing, not because of grand gestures, but because of this small, quiet act of respect, a single nod that said, without words, that she was allowed to exist in this space, safe and unjudged.